All right, we are live, and today I have with me John Potash. And am I saying that correctly, Potash?
That's fine. Yeah.
Perfect. And we're covering, well, the CIA, probably some FBI, continuing this track. Now, John likes long titles to his books.
To
Let
be
me see.
censorship.
It is I don't, is it an SEO thing, but you have the FBI war on Tupac Shakur and black leaders, U.S. intelligence's murderous targeting of Tupac, MLK, Malcolm, Panthers, Hendrix, Marley, rappers, and linked ethnic leftists. That's one book. And then the shorter title is Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA's murderous targeting of SDS, Panthers, Hendrix, Lennon, Cobain, Tupac, and other activists. And that one you also turned into a documentary that you self-funded that is
Yeah,
available on Amazon Prime right now,
yeah.
correct?
I turned them both into documentaries, but the second documentary is much more widespread. It's as I say, it's available now in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, in places like that. Besides just the U.S.
Well, awesome. Now, there you cover so much stuff, and I tangentially cover the CIA as well. I have a CIA three-part series with CIA in film, CIA in the news, and family of CIA that I'm doing with Mark Robert. And we started our three-parter on Sirhan. And I know you talked a little bit about that with Bobby Kennedy. So this is going to be fun. Another guest I had on recently is Mike Levine, who's a DEA agent that
Yeah,
I believe is also in your movie,
yes, yeah.
who appeared. So I don't know how far we're going to get.
Okay.
This goes all the way back to MKUltra,
Hmm.
and I'd love to start there because
Sure.
I love going down this rabbit hole. So
Yeah.
if we could start at the beginning with essentially, or I guess the beginning of what I'm asking, but
Hmm.
MKUltra and how you're tying it specifically to rock and then other forms of music later as they became popular. But it started with rock, correct?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, MK Ultra was about uh, basically controlling the masses through by getting them the kind of information to make them think that they're acting in their own best interest, but they're really acting in the interest of U.S. intelligence who are working for the oligarchs, and the oligarchs being the kind of the Rockefellers, Carnegies, J.P. Morgan interests, etc. Those Harrimans and all them. So yeah, that's it. And so what I found was that music was the way to reach people's hearts and minds the best. I mean, they took a lot of Nazis from Nazi Germany, Nazi
Mhm.
scientists, brought them into MK Ultra, and then saved many more, other Nazis for South America. But the
Mhm.
ones in MK Ultra, Goebbels had said it's not about controlling people physically; it's about controlling their hearts and minds. And music, it's arguably the best way to control people's hearts and minds. And so by manipulating these young musicians, they can inadvertently get them to promote things that they don't even realize they're promoting. And then when they try to get away from those things and change and to mature and evolve over the years, they're done away with. And so that seemed to be the basic pattern, because MK Ultra was about, in the documents, in the MK Ultra documents, it's about using drugs for unconventional warfare. And of course,
Mhm.
people think of that as warfare on foreign lands. But what I show the evidence of is that the main warfare was used when American dissidents, as well as British dissidents and European dissidents. But I focus mostly on American and British dissidents. And those people that were dissenting against dissenting in protest for civil rights, those people that were dissenting against the war, protesting the wars, perpetual war, which is a perpetual part of our world in America's been in perpetual war since World War II, you could say, with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, low level wars in Central America, Afghanistan, Iraq, drone bombing, et cetera, of course, Libya and Syria, et cetera. So, and and amongst those wars, the use of, the reason they coveted the drugs in many of those wars. Central America, they coveted the cocaine. In the two longest wars in U.S. history, in Syria, in Vietnam and Afghanistan, they coveted the poppy fields to produce the opium and the heroin. And why? Because they knew that they could use those drugs to sedate, divide, and oppress the masses. And I got that kind of last statement. I added the oppress, but Ramsey Clark, former U.S. Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson, talked to me at in 1991 at a conference, and I asked him. I was working as a drug counselor at that time in Baltimore City, and talked to him about the politics of drugs. And he said, "Well, I think drugs are used to sedate and control the masses." And I'd asked him about that issue, and he said it outright. And I would just add oppress the masses, because when certain psychedelics, I believe, kind of oppress certain parts of our minds to make us a bit more dysfunctional in the moment, and maybe even a little bit longer term, while of course the heroin and the cocaine, the addiction, oppresses us in the sense of it hurts our lives when we become addicted, and it hurts the lives of our families and our whole communities when someone becomes addicted. And so that's basically part of the way it works. Now, if you can, of course, manipulate these musicians who young people's hearts and minds so much, you can make them either consciously or subconsciously want to emulate these musicians we love and get them using these same drugs. I mean, there's nothing natural about taking a needle, filling it up with this, heroin, and injecting into your veins. It's the most unnatural thing you can possibly imagine. Who can imagine they would ever grow up to do that? But when you see these musicians you love doing that, you can emulate them. And when I was counseling young people, including young musicians, they said they loved Kurt Cobain, for example, and they always wanted to be like Kurt Cobain, and they actually ended up shooting up heroin like him, because partly out of their love for him. And if you track what was happening in the 1990s, heroin use went up 10% every year when Nirvana first broke it big. 1991, 92, 93, and onwards, heroin kept rising in popularity, starting with Nirvana, but also with the whole grunge scene that Courtney Love helped cultivate in Seattle. And when I say help cultivate, she just was probably one of the biggest purveyors of heroin into the scene, in terms of getting so many people shooting up more than ever. I mean, of course, she got Kurt Cobain using heroin daily for the first time in his life, by all accounts, and she just brought heroin to a bunch of people in that scene. And so that's part of what it's all about.
Okay, now it kind of changed up though, right? I mean, if you go by like John Mark's book about finding Manchurian, which is a great source if you want to look into MKUltra. He's the one who really broke it, and fed the Church Commission. It started out with cannabis, and then went into LSD with little MDMA,
right?
Also thrown in there. I think there was a couple other ones I forgot.
Yeah,
but
it was the precursor of MDMA at that time, MDA. But yeah, right.
Yeah, it seemed like it started out with acid, but then they brought in I guess heroin, morphine, the opiates, and then that kind of went down a bit, like post-Vietnam, and they brought in but then we started to look at cocaine becoming an issue, specifically base and crack. And it seems like as that died out, then that's when the heroin started to come back in the 90s. And I'm finding this an interesting cyclical type of thing. Like, it's not just a straight through one thing all the time.
Not that cyclical, Eric. And I only know this because, having started in the field in 1989 as a drug and alcohol counselor, I saw our statistics, and I saw the statistics for Baltimore, and Baltimore is probably just any city, any major city, USA. Heroin was popular from the time I started in 1989, but I saw it back into the beginning of the 1980s. Even the beginning of the 1980s, heroin was the most popular drug in Baltimore. I mean, for our clinic, but a lot of clinics, heroin was very popular. Okay, in the inner city, in Baltimore City. It got cocaine started to rise up. Baltimore's, I say Baltimore's like 2 or 3 years behind New York all the time for some reason. But so cocaine got really big in New York around 83, 84. It became really big in Baltimore about 85, 86. But it never surpassed heroin. They were always at cocaine's peak, they were parallel. They were about the same level of use. And so what happened, there was just a brief dip. There was a brief dip in heroin. When we got out of Vietnam, we lost that supply. American military lost that supply in Vietnam when we lost Vietnam and got out of there. But by 1979, we found a new supply. Now, in Vietnam, it was the golden triangle for heroin. That's what it's called, those poppy fields. Great, best poppy fields in the world for heroin, for opiate, to produce opium and heroin. That's at one end of the Himalayan mountains. At the other end of the Himalayan mountains, and along the Himalayan mountains, of course, is India, where there was tons of heroin also produced. But basically, the two ends of the Himalayan mountains were first Vietnam was under French control, but then of course we fought for it and tried to win it over in the 60s and 70s and got out of there. And there was a dip there then in heroin. But in 1979, we cultivated our connection there with a leader of the what was called then the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, I just forgot his name, but he's in my book and film. But this one guy was our central guy, but there was a group of people that were cultivating heroin starting in 1979 and cultivating anti-Soviet Union sentiment because a socialist government had kind of won election in Afghanistan. And my understanding at that point, and we wanted to topple anyone that was not hyper-capitalist. I mean, that's what our oligarchs are all about. And so we got we got this band of heroin traffickers going around that region, Pakistan and Afghanistan. This comes from some of the top experts for PBS. They say this in my film. And so, they got bigger and bigger, and our opium supply got bigger and bigger from that area from 1979 onwards. And that's why in Baltimore, even as early as the early 1980s, heroin was big in Baltimore again in the early 1980s. And so then it stayed big, and it actually never dipped because that supply never ended until the year 2000. And that supply ended in the year 2000 because the Taliban, for some reason, agreed with, there was a kind of something put out there. I can't remember who it was by, if it was by the United Nations or what, but they said, they requested that all heroin production be stopped because of the damage it's doing to the world. And Taliban's the only one that actually listened to that and actually put a ban on heroin. They said, well, maybe we're going to try to look good or whatever. All of a sudden, they put a ban on heroin. And for a year, the heroin production dropped by about 95%. It was incredible. I'm not even sure how they did it, but New York Times talked about it. The Washington Post talked about it. This was an open thing. And my film discusses why that couldn't be done, why the United States couldn't abide by that. A woman named Catherine Austin Fitts was the Assistant Secretary of Housing under George Bush Sr., and she became kind of a radical activist, actually, believe it or not, coming out of that job. And she was an insider in Wall Street. She was in the top level of Wall Street, brilliant woman, advising billionaires on stock issues. And she ends up blowing the whistle on what was really going on. And she basically said that cash, street cash, tons of inflows of cash from drug deals and gun running and different other black ops basically prop up Wall Street. But one of the biggest drugs is the heroin and the heroin dealing, and that incredible amount of cash is laundered through American corporations in the stock market, through the banks and their stocks. Prop up, give it, and they've been caught. Some of the biggest banks in the world, like 5 biggest banks, have been caught money laundering, this cash. So when that cash stopped, when that cash, it didn't completely stop, but when it was majorly decreased by this 95% ban on the largest supply of heroin in the world, which is the golden crescent, for opium poppy fields and opium and heroin, it was dangerous for our stock market. Our stock market was going to fall drastically, and we had to go in. American military had to invade, and but that's part of why we made it. I mean, of course, we use the excuse of looking for Osama bin Laden, which is a joke. Whether he was there or not there, whether I don't think he was even involved in 911, but maybe he was. Whatever. I think 911 was an inside job, but nonetheless, we had to invade, and we had to get those that heroin production back in place, get the poppy fields rolling again, get things going again, and we did, and we brought it up to a higher level than it's ever been. While we were in Afghanistan. Now us pulling out, I don't know what's going to happen, but it's a whole new world.
Well, did the pharmaceuticals help cover some of that gap too?
Oh, sure. I'm sure they did. Yeah. I mean, well, the pharmaceuticals got, cheap opium and for their painkillers, of course. And of course, Johnson & Johnson was part of that. But, what's the biggest one? I forgot the name of that one. Purdue was Purdue and OxyContin was number one. Johnson & Johnson was involved. But yeah, the pharmaceuticals, of course, got cheaper opium for their pain pills that they got so many people addicted to that would then go to heroin after they couldn't get a quick enough high from the pain pills.
We're off the path here, but what about fentanyl now, which is coming in and killing everybody? And the cartels are building it. And talking to Mark Robert, because he actually ran a drug rehab himself, and Dr. Drew, they're extremely concerned about fentanyl. They're saying it's everywhere and everything.
Yeah, it's popping up in so many things. I mean, people are actually smoking weed that ends up getting laced with fentanyl, and I mean, it's not common, but it's happening. I'm hearing stories about it from my clients that family members smoked weed that was laced with fentanyl, and they end up foaming at the mouth and dying. It's very scary. Yeah, it's popping up in so many different drugs, and so it's really worrisome. Yeah, but you gave a really good outline, Eric. I appreciate that outline of MKUltra and the different drugs used from the beginning. And I think that's important because it gets me back right now to talking about LSD, acid was the biggest focus of MKUltra in the beginning. And frankly, the evidence that I show suggests that they never really gave up on that. That's continued till today with the acid. And I say that because, well, first they used it, one of the first most well-known uses of it was against activist Paul Robeson Sr. Paul Robeson was an incredible man. He was considered the best singer in the world. He was a Columbia University trained lawyer. He was trained in Columbia University around the 1930s. He was an All-American football player. He was just an incredible man. He could speak 20 languages. It's just a phenomenal person, one of the most amazing person I've ever read about. And to hear him speak at the HUAC, the McCarthy hearings, was wild. I mean, he was so brilliant. But so they used it on him in 1961. They dosed his drink. Some expat, some like Americans in Russia, Soviet Union at the time, got a hotel room right next to Paul Robeson when he was visiting and singing there. And they ended up inviting him to a party there and dosed his drink. And they did it to him. And then, he called his family and said he thinks he's losing his mind because no one really knew what acid was then, 1961. His adult son, Paul Robeson Jr., came over to see what was going on. And they dosed Paul Robeson Jr.'s drink. And Paul Robeson Jr. has talked about this and said that he was lucky. He just took a sip. He didn't really drink the whole thing and didn't get a full massive acid trip. He got whatever's a lower level acid trip. Now, he said it could have also been a super psychedelic called BZ, but he's gone back and forth. He's not sure if it was acid or BZ. Nonetheless, it was a psychedelic, that they ended up dosing him repeatedly. Paul Robeson Sr. Convinced his wife that he had to go into a mental hospital, and then gave him, overly high doses of ECT 50 plus times. It ruined his mind. and it's just
Oh,
horrible
shock
thing.
treatment.
What's that?
That's electric shock treatment,
Oh,
right?
sorry, right, electric convulsive shock treatment. Yeah, for people that don't know. And so, it was horrible to lose such an incredible man to, because he was an incredible civil rights activist. He was actually 3 weeks away from, he was supposed to meet with Fidel Castro and Che Guevara to talk about, international human rights issues and stuff. And so that was one of the uses of acid or psychedelics in general against activists. But there was a number of situations. There was also the situation with the whistleblower that they made the film documentary Wormwood about. I don't know if you Olson, Frank Olson.
Yeah, Frank Olson. He was a doctor working with them,
Yeah,
and he was a CIA doctor, if I recall, and just kind of went off the reservation a little bit, and suddenly, what shall we say? He was defenestrated.
Yeah, that's he was taken out. I mean, he was so appalled by seeing what was going on in Germany. The MKUltra documents where they would torture people to death in Germany. He said he was so appalled by that and some other experiments he came upon that that he wasn't involved in, that they were doing, that he was trying to get out, and they didn't let him out. He was too, he knew too much. And so first they dosed him and tried to get, out of him what he was gonna, could possibly, blow the whistle on, or it could, what he was thinking about things, and he didn't give up what he wanted to do. And then they, all the best evidence is they threw him out a window in 10th floor of a New York hotel. They had a CIA operative from France, actually a assassin, and another guy just kill him and toss him out a window, and make it look like it was a suicide. And that that plays into the suicide and Kurt Cobain business. But nonetheless, this is what they do. And so coming into when the 60s started to progress, you had a group called the Human Ecology Fund, which was a front company. I mean, like American, basically a sociological society, one of the top magazines for sociology, just came out with the fact that the Human Ecology Fund was a front company for the CIA MKUltra project. And what it did is just to back up a little bit, MKUltra was an umbrella operation. It represented 149 sub-projects. Okay.
Right.
So it was a lot going on.
Project Midnight Climax is one of them.
Yeah, right.
And MKUltra itself fell under partly Operation Paperclip with the Nazi element.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it fell under Paperclip, but they definitely Paperclip fed scientists into MKUltra. Either way you want to look at it.
Pro, which is kind of a partner program with Chaos. So there was a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot of operations, no doubt. There was Chaos. There was Mockingbird, which was control of the press and infiltration of the press, but it was the ownership of the press that they had in their hands, according to Watergate muckraker Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein fame. But nonetheless, so MKUltra had all these operations going on, and so with the Human Ecology Fund funding all these colleges to experiment with acid, first psychedelic mushrooms, then acid on students, plus experimenting on prisoners and experimenting on people in hospitals all around the country. You had a lot of tests on human subjects with acid, and then so some of those little smaller projects on college campuses became bigger. Timothy Leary was the most famous one, probably, the Harvard psychologist who was testing on students. He got his other kind of teachers involved, other professors involved. They ended up working with a guy named William Mellon Hitchcock and his sister Peggy Mellon Hitchcock. They were from the Mellon Hitchcock. The Mellons come from Mellon Bank. They own Gulf Oil. The Hitchcocks were another incredibly wealthy family. They just they were part of the oligarchy. I mean, Mellons actually were also some of the highest up in U.S. intelligence in different parts of the world. And so, they were running a huge acid distribution operation. William Mellon Hitchcock started a group called the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which was it immediately opened up offices in various parts of the country. He ended up getting bigger in California, but it was actually also had an office in Mexico, like virtually instantly. I mean, that's how huge it was, and so it was obviously connected to U.S. intelligence. And so on the West Coast, so they mainly centered in New York City, like just an hour north of New York City, where Billy Mellon Hitchcock gave a mansion to Timothy Leary to hold constant parties. And MKUltra scientists just hung out there and just experimented on anyone they could lure up to that mansion. They lured civil rights activists up there. They lured entertainers from New York City up there. They got tons of people using acid and tried to hurt their minds, so they didn't do the best activism in the civil rights movement, I argue, and I just showed the evidence of that. And on the West Coast, a different kind but similar kind of operation was running through Ken Kesey, and I think Ken Kesey, he was a experimental subject for MKUltra at Stanford University when he was in the grad writing program there. I don't believe he actually knew what was going on. I believe he was manipulated to throw these parties where it was, had constant acid at these parties. But then when he kind of didn't like the parties anymore, he tried to stop them, but they kept going despite his trying to stop them. And loads again.
I want to throw in a couple names that occurred with Leary and the Boston crew. Ted Kaczynski, Whitey Bulger.
Right, Whitey Bulger, right, with MKUltra in the prison. Ted Kaczynski in Harvard University. Yeah, and with Kaczynski, not only did they experiment with him with acid, but then they psychologically tortured him for several years, while experimenting with him with acid. So they created a monster in him, no doubt. And and so then the West Coast, you had Ken Kesey with first his acid parties, then his acid tests, and then they became the Trips Festival. And people, so the top psychologist of MKUltra, Todd Gittinger, said in in court documents, he said in an affidavit that he was present at least several of the acid tests on the West Coast with two other CIA scientists. And he was also at the Trips Festival with two other CIA scientists. So they're traveling all the way from Washington to, the California area, the San Francisco area, to be at these, supposedly underground, acid parties. So these were obviously MKUltra events. And
Grateful Dead was involved with that, correct?
Grateful Dead was involved from the start. There's, the name first was the Warlocks. They changed to the Grateful Dead. But yes, they were involved from the start. And yes, I've talked to people who said, yeah, I dealt acid and I got it directly from the top, from the Dead themselves. And so this is part of what all happened. And it kept ballooning to bigger and bigger acid parties. You had the be-ins, which they said there was about 100 around the country, where they would have tens of thousands of people, and they were just distributing all different kinds of psychedelics, experimenting on these people, and then they became the huge music fest. And of course, I love music fest. Everyone loves music and music fest, but it's sad that they took advantage of these music fests to distribute, psychedelics like crazy.
Now I'm curious, okay, because I always like, it's like, okay, a lot of stuff's going on. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's got to be good motivation. Like one, they risk getting their own kids mixed up in this mess. So one thing that I'm wondering is if it was a generational gap issue and they were thinking, okay, rock and roll is music of the devil, or damn close in their mind, whatever. I'm just throwing that out there. And by targeting musicians, because you mentioned John Lennon, George Harrison, the Stones, are you in essence targeting a specific community who is listening to said music? Like, these people have this particular mindset, we're going to target them, but our good kids, they're not listening to that music, or they're going to be listening to something else, so they'll be safe. I'm just wondering if you've ever thought about this, or
I can't. I can't tell you how much they care about their own kids or not. I don't know. All I can say is the best evidence that I found, and I, put in my book with the over 1,000 endnotes documenting the sources, and in my film with a lot of those sources, saying these things in the film, is the fact that it appears that they were targeting civil rights activists and anti-war activists, and trying to divert the younger generation, what was the yuppie generation, was the boomer generation, very large generation of people, from stopping, from their anti-war activism, from stopping the Vietnam War, and from the civil rights activism that gained blacks, and other people of color more civil rights. And so I showed the evidence of that. I mean, to the point of having undercover agents dose some of these top anti-war activist leaders and civil rights activist leaders. Yeah.
Yeah, let's go to John Lennon, because definitely want to get on the cover. He's an important one, and I also wanted to know, because you mentioned specifically John Lennon, George Harrison, and the Stones, but you didn't talk about like the UFO Club in England and London. The UFO Club.
What's the
UFO?
UFO?
Pink Floyd. Yeah, Pink Floyd came out of there.
Okay.
Sid Barrett was known for losing his mind on acid. I'm wondering if there was involvement there, because I mean that was very deep in the, that whole psychedelic movement was all about acid.
Yeah, I did want to put Sid Barrett in there, and I just, I had to limit the length of the book to make it readable. There's only, you go over 500 pages. Who's going to read that, really? I mean, it's going to decrease the amount of readership, But I didn't put Sid Barrett in there, though I would like to. I think Sid Barrett lost his mind on acid. But I'll just say that in 1965, Robert Lashbrook, the assistant director of MKUltra, according to a guy named A.M. Hotchner, he says that Hotchner was the editor for Ernest Hemingway. He's a very well-known, great editor and a great writer. He wrote a great oral history of the Rolling Stones called Blown Away. And Hotchner, in that history of the Rolling Stones, covers the era, and he says that Robert Lashbrook, assistant director of MKUltra, came over to London in 1965 with loads of LSD, loads of agents, and loads of money, and instructed the agents, and he interviewed some of the agents that said this, to get acid in as many musicians' hands as possible. Now, they pretended like they were just trying to do an experiment on acid and creativity. But what happens next, within a number of months, all of a sudden, John Lennon and George Harrison are having dinner over George Harrison's dentist's house with their partners, and the dentist doses their coffee with LSD. And George Harrison says, "What's LSD?" And after he drank it, and he said, and John Lennon said, "It's a drug. They dosed us. This is terrible." And they were really, Lennon was really pissed off. Now, so that's one issue that happened. Now, within a year, enough Americans convinced, and other people and other people convinced John Lennon and George Harrison to try it again. But at that time, they couldn't believe it. Why did this dentist do this? I mean, it's a pretty incredible thing to do at a time when people didn't know, this guy doesn't even know what acid is, to do that to your patient. He was George Harrison's dentist. Anyway, it should have been assault, really, but anyway, then 2 years later, so meanwhile, but 2 years later, Mick Jagger actually had been in a holdout, according to Hotchner's book. His name's A.E. Hotchner, I'm sorry. But Hotchner said that 2 years later, Jagger had been the holdout in the Rolling Stones. He would not take acid, he wouldn't trip. And finally, a guy named Schneiderman, according to the Daily Mail, which is one of the top two, daily newspapers in London, Daily Mail said that Hotchner was actually working undercover for both the FBI and MI5, which is British FBI, when he brought tons of drugs in a briefcase to a party of Keith Richards, where Jagger was there. He convinced Jagger to try acid for the first time, and within several hours, the police came in and arrested Richards and Jagger, but didn't arrest Schneiderman, of course, who had a briefcase full of drugs on him. and that popularized acid. So every time they do that, they try to get these musicians, using it to then popularize it, and that's the part of the way it works. And so John Lennon, people convinced him to do it again. He thought he was losing his mind at one point, but Yoko convinced him he wasn't, and another guy that was around him tried to convince him he wasn't losing his mind. But he was throwing up before concerts in 1971. He said he threw up for hours before performing because he was so anxious, and that's what acid does. It kind of unnerves people. It makes them less emotionally in control, and causes major anxiety. I mean, I counseled people that would wake up and throw up in the morning. They were so anxious about just facing the day, believe it or not, from tripping so much. And so
on that point, real quickly, because I saw this in the chat and I do want to bring it up because I think it's very important. Chris Dreyer saying, I am still doing acid. What should I be worried about? So I do want to pause everything just to say, because this is important.
Yeah, no, thanks, Chris, for asking the question. What I would do is I would just stop using it and just don't go back to it again. Look, I've tripped a half dozen times myself. I was duped and fooled into thinking like it was something positive. And it took me a long time. I lost some abilities I never regained, to be honest. I had some memory abilities that really made things easy for me in school, and things got a lot harder for a while. It took about a year to get some of my, to get my abilities back, though I never got everything back. You will get abilities back in the slowly but surely, but it does take a little while, and I'm talking about maybe months or maybe a year or two or so. But the further away you get from using acid, the better, the more control you'll get again, and the better you'll more confident you'll get again. But just get away from it. It's just, don't be duped by it. That's all.
Okay, yeah. Now, sorry, back to the story, but I was like, that was important. Now, okay, around the same time, didn't Cass Elliot of the Mamas and Papas get wrapped up in that mix too? And
yeah,
that ties into the Manson family and all that. There's so many things.
There's so many stories. I mean, that book Chaos is a really good book about the Manson family. I don't know if you've heard about that.
Yeah, I interviewed Tom.
Yeah, Tom's great. I mean, he did a great job of revealing things about the Manson family. I alluded to the connections between Manson family and Process Church, and the Process Church is, in my book I talk about Process Church has been shown, the evidence shows that they're a U.S. intelligence front group. But so that's the way that's another whole can of worms. But that's the way they basically can use this, trauma to create dissociative identity disorder in people, and have them do their bidding, and that's what they did to the Manson family. But Cass Elliot was a victim, sadly enough. I mean, she inadvertently did promote acid with the Mamas and the Papas, but I think the founder of the Mamas and the Papas, I just skipped on his name all of a sudden, but when the lead male singers was the guy who was whose family was military and military intelligence, and I think he was an undercover agent that promoted, had some of the biggest constant parties in the Laurel Canyon scene, which Dave McGowan, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. And so I talk about that in my book and film a good bit, and have Dave, sadly, rest in peace, Dave, in my film, mention talking a little bit about that. But it's so yeah, that was another hot spot in Los Angeles. I talked about San Francisco, I talked about New York, but that was Los Angeles. That was a hot spot in Los Angeles for having constant parties, trying to constantly promote acid, heroin, cocaine to actors and musicians that would visit that area. And that's the second time that John Lennon tripped, was just within maybe 10-15 minutes of the Laurel Canyon area, when another serious promoter of those drugs, David Crosby, who was military, his full name is David Van Cortlandt Crosby, and so people who are from New York know Van Cortlandt Parkway. It's named after his family. There's a 1,000-acre park or something, the Van Cortlandt Park and all. He comes from a super wealthy family, and his parents were in military. I mean, some of his family were partly military, and he was part of it all, sadly enough. But he was
Amazing.
more a knowing part of it, unlike John Lennon, who was duped and unknowing. And then when John Lennon tried to sober up and break out, he was killed. And that's the same thing that happened to Jimi Hendrix. He was duped and manipulated when he tried to break out and sober up and try to get more into activism. They were both killed. And same thing happened, of course, to Tupac Shakur and Kurt Cobain.
How about Jim Morrison?
Well, Jim Morrison was one. I had another one like Sid Barrett that I just wasn't sure if I should put him in or not. It just wasn't so crystal clear. Like when he broke out of his father was the commander of the ship that launched the Vietnam War. You know, his father's the commander of the ship that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where they pretended like there was the Gulf of Tonkin, the ship he was commanding was fired on when it wasn't. It was I have a Naval Institute report on that in my film, showed in my film and talked about in my book, that it was a made up reason to start to get troops into Vietnam. And so I have a picture of Jim Morrison with his dad on a boat, it might have been that boat actually. But so this is where they got some of their first people, like going in there undercover and promoting these drugs and then becoming instant music stars, whether they had talent or not. It's arguable that some of these musicians really didn't have much talent. It was this band, the Wrecking Crew, that were the really professional musicians that did really most of the music behind them.
In LA,
yeah, in LA, we're talking about the Laurel Canyon music scene. Some of them, of course, could play their music, and some couldn't. But nonetheless,
and they learned as they went too. So it was probably hard to
along. Yeah, right. They learned as they went along. They started out like instant music stars, despite not being really musicians. Or you're barely musicians, we'll say. So Morrison, he was a bright guy who had talent in some ways, but they of course propped him up and made him instant star. And I argue now, talking about it, I just mentioned him in my book. I don't, and mention him in my film. I don't really talk about it in depth because I just don't have the space. But I do think he probably broke away. He fit the pattern of breaking away and saying, "I don't want to do this anymore," and started, saying that the media is being manipulated to control us. In one point, he said something about the media that was about the way the wealthiest are controlling it. And so he died at 27 years old, like Janis Joplin, like Jimi Hendrix. Now, I don't talk about this in my book outright, but the 27 Club they talk about it's under something I talk about later, which is the idea of an anniversary timing tactic or a threat timing tactic that appeared to be, I found that in the targeting of black leaders, such as, the cultural icon Tupac Shakur, Martha King, the head of the Congo, which is the country with probably arguably the most resources in the world. And other black leaders. There was a threat timing tactic where on an anniversary, they would commit an atrocity, they would kill a leader or kill someone involved. And it could be said possibly that when they killed, a number of these musicians turning activists at 27, Kurt Cobain was one of them, because, it was a subconscious warning to other musicians. If you try to sober up and turn into activists, this is what's going to happen to you.
Also lore. I mean, there's a lore with that. It's like everybody dies at 27. Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, also 27 Club. And you were just talking about the Rolling Stones.
Right.
His death was, I think they've determined definitely, I think they've called it a murder now, but, his assailant has already passed away. So if that was the case, so I'm not, trashing myself.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how officially they've called it a murder. They should have, obviously. I mean, I have someone in my film. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. It's just on the bonus tracks of my film. It's I wish I hadn't cut that out of the main part of the film, but it's on the bonus tracks. You can get, if you buy the physical DVD, you can see the bonus tracks of Brian Jones's death. That was a really tough decision about whether to keep that in there or not. I wish I had, actually, but it's in my book in depth. And then film, it's in the bonus tracks, but bonus scenes. But Brian Jones him and Mick Jagger were the most activists of the Rolling Stones, attending anti-war rallies. And, and obviously, arguably, Brian Jones was the most talented musician in the Rolling Stones. He founded the group. He was a great guitarist. He could play a bunch of different instruments.
Yep.
Yeah, he was sobering up before his death, and they said he drowned in his own swimming pool. And even Keith Richards, who doesn't speak out much, said that it's ridiculous that Brian Jones drowned in his own swimming pool. I've seen him swimming in the ocean with breakers up to here. He said it's just like the Kennedy thing. We can't get, we try to look into it, we can't get to the bottom of it, and it's terrible. And so,
so partially responsible because he sent the guy whom they suspected to Brian Jones because he was pissed at Jones at the time. So there's like a conflict between them and the individual involved. I don't know if that guy was connected or anything, but Keith Richards actually is the one who sent him over there, kind of like, oh yeah, well, screw you.
I never read that exact account, but nonetheless, yeah, 3 guys. I mean, a guy from the Guinness beer family, a guy named Fitzgerald, was friends with Brian Jones. And he went away from the house to pick up another friend from an area nearby. He was coming back to Brian Jones's house, and all of a sudden there's a party at Brian Jones's house. He says that he wasn't going to have a party. He didn't plan to have a party. All of a sudden there's a party there, and there's cars blocking the driveway. So he parked somewhere else, walked all the way around the back, and sees 3 guys drowning someone in a pool, in Brian Jones's pool. And he says, what the hell is going on here? And all of a sudden someone jumps out, pops out of the bushes and says, you better get out of here, Fitzgerald, or you'll be next. And so he was scared to death. What he ended up finding out, and he said in his memoirs, is the fact that they were killing, Brian Jones. And so I also have in my film, though, that, in the bonus scenes, that one of the tour managers for the Stones said that one of the killers admitted on his deathbed to him, said, I helped kill Brian, and so, yeah, it's terrible though. And he was 27, he was sobering up, and he was also talking about forming, he'd already talked to John Lennon and Jimi Hendrix about forming a supergroup in 1969. So, yeah.
Okay, so now moving forward, because we almost tangentially touched on it, talking about the acid parties and the Grateful Dead, who was kind of the house band for that. Their manager at the time, I believe, was a father to somebody who becomes very important later, shall we say, in the 90s.
Yeah. So their first manager was Hank Harrison, and Hank, he's not seen as the most reliable witness, but I just double checked, the most important facts from a kind of pre-published manuscript he sent me by email, electronic version of it, and interviewed him at length about all of the most important facts in that manuscript, and tried to find backing for the ones I found backing for the ones I put in my book and film. And what he says is that he basically had this kind of fling with this woman who, Carol, they all change their names. It's really bizarre, but Linda Carroll, she's the adopted daughter of this super wealthy couple who have stock in Bausch and Lomb, like major stock in Bausch and Lomb and uranium mines, etc. The father's an alcoholic. She says in her memoir that he sexually abused her. So she has, anyway, she has this fling with this, maybe they dated for a short period, but whatever, with Hank Harrison. Hank Harrison said they had the baby, Courtney Love, and they were separated though. And Courtney Love would cry and scream every time she had to go back to her mother, Linda Carroll. And he described Linda Carroll's bizarre behaviors, but when Courtney Love was about 4 or 5 years old, though, basically they were fighting for custody, and the super rich parents of Linda Carroll paid off Hank Harrison's lawyer so that he couldn't see her at all for years. And he says he went into a deep depression from it. And meanwhile, Courtney Love is going through a bizarre little childhood, going in and out of counseling from ages change in different biographies. 2 or 4 years old is when she started, in different biographies and different memoirs. And she ends up, he ends up hearing from her again when she's in a juvenile detention facility, and when she's 13 years old, and wrote him a letter saying, my counselors, and psychiatrists were all having sex with me and giving me all kinds of drugs like Tuinol and Seconal, and these are MKUltra psychohypnotic drugs, okay, that they used along with trauma to cause dissociative disorder and dissociative identity disorder in victims. And they used, of course, sexual trauma in those, prime years, those delicate years of between 3 and 8 years old, when your brain can split, can cause dissociative disorder. And I get this more into this in my book. My film, I don't go into this kind of detail because it's just too much. But so anyway, so he gets her out of this facility when she's 13 years old, and he finds he had taken in what's turned into his daughter, turned into somewhat of a monster. She was a heroin addict. She was prostituting herself in her teen years. By the age of about 14 or 15, he says, and she said in a memoir actually, that she was already prostituting for the she basically said in one of her memoirs, she said she prostituted herself for a boyfriend to get back to a boyfriend from Asia, from Taiwan. In another memoir, she said she was part of the white slave trade, and this is an authorized biography of her. She says she was part of the white slave trade for the Japanese mafia in Japan, And so she's going through her teen years prostituting, by all accounts. And then she ends up at 17 years old. Like, she just turned 17. She visits her father, who had gone to Dublin to do some research, or Ireland, another part of Ireland, to do some research. He was a writer. He left the Grateful Dead managing after 6 months, and then was writing. And so she visits him there, and he says that somebody befriended him there, a guy named Stephen OLeary. And she introduced Steve OLeary to Courtney, and Steve OLeary started having sex with Courtney, 17-year-old Courtney, and then took her to London. And took her to England. I can't remember. I think if it was London, or if it was another major city there. I think it was a slightly smaller city, but it was a big music scene. It might have been Manchester. It was a big music scene where people like Adam and the Ant were launching, and a lot of other big musicians were launching. The Pogues would play there. And she ended up bringing 1,000 hits of acid, and which is parallel to what Lashbrook, what MKUltra assistant director Lashbrook did. He brought tons of acid over to England, and she passed it around like candy. And she slept with tons of musicians. She almost broke up the Pogues, this Irish punk band, and so Stephen OLeary is accompanying her and handling her, and actually Steve OLeary, Harrison said Steve OLeary's brother was part of this at times.
And his brother's name is
Kevin OLeary. Yeah, I know. And she's been seen in pictures with Kevin OLeary in the last 5-10 years still.
We don't know.
I don't know if it's the same Kevin OLeary or not, to be honest, but it's awfully coincidental. And I did find an obituary that confirmed what he said about Stephen OLeary sending him a letter in 2005 or 6 or so, saying, I'm dying of cancer, but I just wanted to tell you that I was actually working for the CIA at that time, in Ireland, when I was met your daughter Courtney. And so I found an obituary in Minnesota where Harrison said the letter came, where Stephen OLeary was and was dying of cancer. And that Stephen OLeary did have a brother named Kevin OLeary, I found in the obituary. And so that's awfully coincidental, is all I can say. But here you got a guy admitting to working for the CIA, escorting Courtney Love through the British music scene. Courtney Love ends up duplicating that same behaviors through a bunch of American music punk scenes. And in the 80s and 90s, marrying the top punk musician, Roz Resbeck, maybe it might have been, I forgot his name, maybe a different guy in LA though, and gets married to this guy. This guy thought he was marrying a punk feminist, he said, but it turns out he was with a right-wing Phyllis Diller. He says she would brag about sleeping with generals in Alaska, and they would tell her how good wars were for us, and so she had an inside scoop on how wars are good for us, and and she would get like hitmen to like beat him up anytime he didn't do what she wanted him to do, and he finally got away from her. But then she ends up, of course, coming to Kurt Cobain, getting him hooked on heroin, getting him using daily for the first time in his life. He had a massive stomach problem and was an easy target for that because the stomach did help his. I mean, the heroin did help his, ease his stomach pain. But he finally found a cure for his stomach pain a year before he died, and so I have him saying this in an interview. And he also, about a month or two before his death, it was actually a month before his death, he was in Rome doing a tour, and he just wanted to see his daughter, Frances Cobain, but they were divorcing. Courtney and Kurt were divorcing, and but she did want her to bring their daughter over there to see Frances, and by all best evidence, she dosed his, his drink, some drink he was drinking, and with Rohypnol, which was her prescription at the time. It's legal in England where she got it. And it's not legal here. It's roofies, Rohypnol. And he went into a coma. But the hospital where he was in a coma said he had no illicit substances in his system, no heroin, not even.
You have a medical report somewhere?
Yeah. So this came out in Wallace and Halpern's book, where they talked to the doctor over there, and found that out. Yeah.
People are pointing out in the chat, and it's like, I don't know if it's a slight sidetrack or not, but it did come up because I'm looking at the time, where it's like check in. You figure that they're going to be involved. Stuart Copeland of the police, his father was a definite agent, if I recall. Right. I don't know. Was there any kind of involvement you discovered? I don't want to go deep. I just was curious.
Yeah, no, there is. I have that in one chapter of my book. It's too much for, it was too much for the film. But yeah, Miles Copeland was they call a CIA founder and architect. And best evidence is that his sons were just trying to control the industry. One of his sons, I think Miles Copeland Jr. maybe, had a something called IRS booking. It's like really, it's like almost obvious the way they do that. They sometimes make these names after government agencies, but IRS booking, where he basically managed tons of. What's that?
Like Touchstone Pictures?
That's interesting. What's Touchstone? What's that mean? I mean,
Touchstone was I forgot, but it's tied into early CIA.
I didn't know that
organization, and then Touchstone Pictures came about.
Interesting.
And coincidentally, they my partner Mark Robert on a series, he wrote the movie The Recruit, and it turned out that it went to court. He has the cases and everything, that it was written by the CIA.
Oh God!
But he had to go through a battle, and when they was suing, it was like, well, why is this kind of out of work drunk writer involved all of a sudden? And then they found out that the notes were actually being straight out of Langley, the whole movie, and it was made by Touchstone. So anyway, sorry to hijack.
Okay. Yeah, so this guy's running this IRS management group that's managing a bunch of what we consider all these independent bands, and I think a lot of these bands are independent, but they're manipulated and they're steered and they're warned and they're God knows what else is done to control the industry. Stuart Copeland's in police. Police get huge instantly. And Sting, I think, is talented, but Sting was in constant fights with Stuart Copeland. And so, they end up breaking up the band. Sting broke up the band because Stuart Copeland wouldn't let Sting write what he wanted to write. And, so that is a good point about that. And I do talk about that in my book, but again, in the film, it's too much.
Okay, so that kind of covers a little bit of the 70s to 80s bridge in between, because in the 90s, picking back up. So Courtney Love winds up with Kurt Cobain. And yeah, you've got a ton on that. We have one more artist in there that I wanted to talk about briefly. I mean, there's so much to talk about. We can go on and on and on. But Tupac Shakur.
Yeah.
Shakur.
So I wrote my first book and did my first film about Tupac. He was a tangent from the original project, and the thing was, I found so much evidence. I basically just found I was it's a long story, but basically I cold called his lawyer, his New York trial lawyer, and I said, "Do you think they're targeting Tupac like they targeted his Black Panther parents?" They said yes, and no one's writing about it. I said, "Well, I wanted to write a freelance article for one of these national activist magazines that we both knew." He says, "Yeah, I read those magazines too. Sure, I'll give you a lot of information." And Tupac's lawyer was a serious civil rights activist in the '60s and was a spokesman for the Free Mumia Abu-Jamal campaign, and also Tupac was an activist from birth. His mother said, mother was one-time leader of the Harlem Black Panthers, and when she gave birth to Tupac, she said he's going to be the Black Prince of the Revolution. And so he was already, by the time he was 17 years old, he was elected the youngest ever chairman of the New African Panthers, which was a group active in 8 to 10 cities trying to replicate the Black Panthers. And this was about 1989 or so, or 1988, I think, when that happened. And he only left that leadership thinking that, he wanted to go into rap, and he thought maybe he could get his message out better through rap. And he started touring with, Digital Underground, who were Grammy-nominated band out of the Oakland area. And they were touring internationally, and got big, wrote a song with them. And then I got this solo debut. And so he kept his activism up, but just behind the scenes. And people probably don't understand him as well as they should, because of the fact that he had developed a plan with his imprisoned activist stepfather, Mutulu Shakur, saying that he was going to pretend to be this thug in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them, which was part of a Black Panther movement to get the Bloods and Crips to stop fighting each other and stop drug dealing, and turn on to activism, and fight racism and turn on to activism. And it became a very popular movement. It started in Los Angeles, it spread throughout California, and then spread all the way to New York, into the East Coast. And in New York alone, it got the Latin Kings to stop drug dealing. I mean, we're talking about the largest gang in New York at the time, several thousand strong at least. And, professors wrote about this transformation of the Latin Kings. The Young Lords, the, kind of Puerto Rican Black Panthers started that with the Latin Kings, the young Latino gang. It was an incredible transformation, and it was scaring. It hurt the pocketbooks of the CIA drug traffickers, and particularly hurt the pockets of the drug laundering banks. Like I said about the Afghan war, and the Taliban doing, stopping production of opium for that year. It really hurt the banks and their money laundering and the stock market and all that, and the way they put cash through the stock market. It was a major issue. And so Tupac, they tried to kill Tupac. I mean, you can argue between, say, 4 and 6 times before they were successful, U.S. intelligence. And I have all the evidence of police, first lower level police involvement, and until getting all the way up to FBI and possibly, of course, the CIA. But definitely, I show all the connections in both show more connections in my drugs as well. I mean, in my FBI War on Tupac Shakur book, but a lot of connections in my drugs as weapons book too. And my FBI War on Tupac Shakur book has just come out in a new edition with a different publisher, Microcosm Publishing. And so you get the full picture in there, and you get the attack on his family too, Afeni Shakur and Mutulu Shakur, and all the way up to today. What's that?
What about Suge Knight?
Yeah, Suge Knight was like the guy in that Fred Hampton movie. If you saw that Fred Hampton movie, this is a this is a criminal, who he's charged with and increasingly violent crimes. And then all of a sudden he's increasing his amount of violent crimes, but he's not charged at all. And so what they did is they had him they said, well, we'll give you this deal, and you play this part, you'll get this, you play this part, and we won't charge you with anything, and you won't go to jail. And so Suge Knight was given his position. What's that?
So he's an informant, like they suspect.
Informant provocateur, yeah. Really, it's the informants. It's a name informant, but it's really undercover agent. But low level, very low level. Obviously, the Hampton guy was very low level. Knight was a little higher level, but still a low man on the totem pole. His lawyer.
To clarify that, because I have Mike Levine, and he would run up a tree if he heard it. There's a very distinct difference between an informant and an actual operative or agent, because he was an undercover agent. So he gets really touchy on that.
No, well, the DEA is generally more honest than the CIA and the other parts of U.S. intelligence. And Mike Levine was a great undercover agent, a hero, a whistleblower, and a real undercover agent. I mean, in the sense that he really did go out and do incredible work all throughout the world, trying to bust these huge cartels, drug trafficking cartels. But every time he got close to bringing a case to court, the CIA blocked him. And I'm sure he talked about that in his interview with you. I have him in my just talking about some of his stuff. Mike Levine, he's an incredible man. So yeah, I don't mean an undercover agent in that sense. I mean a CIA police intelligence operative, I'll say. Yeah, operative in the sense that they're following instructions from someone higher up to sabotage certain things, sabotage the gang peace truce movement that was turning on to activism, sabotage, and they were doing that at death row functions, and to set up Tupac Shakur for murder by U.S. intelligence. And that's what happened, and Russell Poole, a high-level police detective, stumbled upon this and asked his superiors, what are these dozens and dozens of my fellow police officers doing in all levels of death row records? And they said you can call them troubleshooters or covert agents.
Wow. Amazing. So, all right. Well, this has brought us, a pretty big snapshot of everything. I think we've covered a lot in a relatively short period. The cool thing is we barely scratched the surface.
True.
You've got a 2-hour documentary everybody can watch right now on Amazon Prime if they don't want to dig immediately in the book. That is the same title as the book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us. I'm not going any further, but Drugs as
for international folks, you can see it on Tubi. It's on Tubi, it's on Amazon Prime, it's on what's that, Voodoo or whatever it is. It's on a bunch of platforms, but thanks. Yeah, Amazon Prime's a good place to see it, of course.
Oh, for sure. And then you can go from there. That'll let get you into it, and then you can read the whole book to get the details that you couldn't cover inside of the movie itself.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, man. I'm enjoying this discovery, and I there's this like crazy tapestry. I was considering. I do a little bit of programming, but I was like, it'd be really interesting to put together a database. And I've actually thought about structuring the tables in my head, because there's all these ties. Like I throw names in at there, and then there's the film script, and there's Anderson Cooper. You have Sean Hannity with his CIA pen. You have, there's so much stuff that it is mind blowing. But then I also don't want to go too far down the tinfoil hat thing. So it's like verified, not verified. This is that. Anyway.
Yeah, that's why I have to have the over 1,000 endnotes to just show the sources for this stuff, so people can make up their own minds about the, validity of these sources,
Which, I definitely appreciate. And thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Eric. And so if when my book's actually out now, the FBI War on Tupac Shakur is out with Microcosm Publishing. People can get it from there. I think you can buy it directly from Amazon, even though it says it's coming out October 12th. It's actually, I think you can already buy it from them. But it's coming out with lots of places and lots of stores starting October 12th. So if you want to talk more in depth about that, because that covers Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and others, be happy to talk with you again in the later fall if you have any interest.
Awesome. How about audiobook? Please tell me that you're going to get these done as audio.
I always wanted to, and I just haven't. So thanks for saying that. I'll see if I can. I've got so many projects right now. That's hard, but hopefully by November or something, I will get an audiobook going for you. And one of those,
that helps because this gets turned into a podcast. Guess what podcasts do? They listen to books. I don't have time to read it.
That's
I only have time to listen.
I totally hear you, Eric. I'll try to see if I can do that sometime with the next few months. Okay.
Just go to acx.com. There's narrators. You could probably work something out for 50% or whatever. There's deals. You can pay them directly. acx.com. So anyway,
thanks.
I can talk
I don't know about that, so thanks for telling me. Great.
Good thing.
All right. Good talking to you, Eric.
All right. Good. Thank you so much.